Welcome back to another episode of Who's to Say. I'm your host, Tom Foolery, and I'm coming to you live in the midst of a admittedly very challenging and also very rewarding 48-hour fast. And I'm not quite in the middle of it, but the throes are very real. And I thought it an opportune time to discuss some of what I've come to experience and learn about fasting. Experience, of course, being the core of it. It's one thing to study it and act like you know, but until you subject yourself to it, you really don't know. And I'll have to jump right into somewhat of an advertisement because, especially during a long fast, one of the most critical supplements to compensate for what you might be missing in your daily diet are electrolytes. And I lean into Element electrolytes, LMNT. You may be familiar with them. They've certainly caught fire because they're endorsed by a lot of NFL teams, NBA teams, fighters, and a lot of people in this wellness and well-being space. And I really got hooked on them, honestly, when I discovered they had a mint chocolate variety, and that's something that I will occasionally feature in my coffee. Have it black otherwise, but they blend in so nicely. 0 grams of sugar. I think they're 5 calories or less, and they're employed more as a sports drink as well. In terms of protocol, they're great after a workout. They're great during too, especially if you're doing a longer endurance workout of some sort. But they are so invaluable because with magnesium, sodium, potassium in spades, I mean, those are things that we may not always have as staples in our regular diet. So, as I've mentioned before, we have to go to some lengths to make up for the things that are missing. And, I mentioned the relevance of this in a long fast because it's so easy to get dehydrated in that time when you don't have any nutrients coming into your body to process. So, I'm a massive fan of Element. It was a game changer, especially this summer playing tennis when it's brutally humid, especially here in New England. I remember once playing tennis at noon in July, and as soon as I got out there, I was really second guessing myself. But luckily, I had my Element electrolytes with me, and I'm pretty sure those are the reason I'm here with you today and not still in the bloody hospital. So do check it out. They're running some great programs right now. You can scour the internet for options, but I think their basic offering is for the cost of shipping, you get an 8 pack of a variety of individual servings. And I love the raspberry, watermelon, the citrus is brilliant, the orange is delicious. Like I said, the mint chocolate, the chocolate is great. Those are, I think, awesome for protein shakes and coffee, but they're so versatile and really so essential. And I had to throw that in there because, like I said, today I had a workout this morning, and knowing that I wasn't going to get to refuel with steak and eggs or bacon or a real protein or fat source, I at least knew I had my Element electrolytes. So thank you to them. Shout out to Rob Wolf, who's one of those co-founders there. He's a brilliant guy in the nutrition space and someone I really admire for his cutting edge honesty and always trying to move that needle. But I'll give another shout out to someone who inspired this particular podcast, and it is the original gangster and godfather of all things biohacking. And of course, that's a loosely interpreted phrase these days, but Dave Asprey, man, I think he's someone I've mentioned here before. And when I encountered his work, it opened my eyes to, even though biohacking might sound like a complex undertaking, he makes it simple and applicable. And for the most part, he highlights cheap solutions or totally free solutions when he talks about how we can hack our sleep and things we can do, shutting off the Wi-Fi, sleeping closer to the ground, eating 3 to 4 hours before bed, all things that are will have some overlap here in this discussion of fasting. But I know that he was someone who really was at the forefront of making this more mainstream. And fasting, as I may have mentioned, used to just be called life for our primal and early history ancestors. uh, Something we'll speak about at length another time, but the symptoms of modernity and convenience are not always favorable to our health and longevity. And I want to set the stage here because you may be asking, why is a 27-year-old so passionate about fasting? What I'm especially committed to and married to, in a way, is this idea of health span being infinitely more important than lifespan. I have so many podcast episode ideas that are in the queue related to these very things, but this might be a bit of a shocking statement, but I really do believe that we are not living longer, we are dying longer. And that ties into the health span, meaning that I think especially end of life, or you can call it second half of life, especially in this country, we know how people are suffering, and it doesn't happen overnight. Yes, it starts in your youth and through bad habits and momentum that gets away from you, but I think especially in the last third of life, people are really struggling with their quality of life. And as we know from examples of Dr. Peter Attia, that if you want to make it to the Centenarian Olympics, the work starts now. And that's why I wanted to call attention to this. One qualifier I'll make, and I have this corroborated by a recent guest on Dave Asprey's podcast when they were talking about podcasting, excuse me, fasting for women. And I'll admit, I'm going to try to keep this broad strokes and much more digestible. Little irony there, since we're talking about fasting, and you won't be digesting anything for hours and days at a time. But I know it was great that he opened with asking his guest, a woman, someone who's done a TED talk about this. What are the differences between fasting for men versus women? And her immediate response was everything. So I want to acknowledge that. I'll speak to it a little bit in terms of what those qualifications might be. But when I say the work starts now, I do mean in your 20s and in this first phase of life. Uh, when I first encountered fasting and started to mess around with it, I started to wonder, what would my life have been like if I started doing this in high school? And in high school, for those of you who don't know, I traveled from Cape Cod to Boston, and that was usually about a 2 hour plus commute. And I did that for 4 years, and for several years afterward, as I attended UMass Boston, which is on the same beautiful peninsula in Dorchester, just south of Boston. And that's a long day when you're waking up at 5 a.m. and you don't get home until after 7:30, 8 p.m., and then you have to eat dinner and do homework. And if I were to fast, for 16, 18, 20, 24 hours, I think at that age and with those demands, nutrition is such a critical piece of the puzzle. And we used to get, I remember from our strength and conditioning coaches, not quite dietary plans, but guidelines of things to be eating. And I remember, they would have recommendations of replacing French fries with potatoes, and that might be a trite example, but it was a great guidebook for what to eat as an athlete, especially as a 3-season athlete. And I bring this up because we know how easy it is for young people to get connected to some of these, you could say, more extreme fitness and wellness activities. But that's one of the caveats I wanted to address first, is that while I do think fasting is quite actually for everyone, you have to earn it, and you do have to grow and develop and make the most of your nutrient development and processing first. And I don't quite have the evidence to say this, but I think it's after your adolescent years and probably into college and beyond when people can start messing around with this. But to start us off with a simple definition, fasting just means going without, and we will come full circle with some other things that we can go without. But of course, here we're talking about nutrients and food. And one thing I think about all the time when I get pushback from people in terms of, well, I've done that and I always feel like crap, or, I don't understand the benefits of it, because I'll skip breakfast all the time, because I'm so busy. This, of course, is related to the concept that I've come to know quite deeply, which is the mind body. And if you accidentally fast, meaning like if you skip breakfast and lunch because you're working so hard and you were ignoring some of your bodily compulsions, then that doesn't quite align with what we're talking about here, because this is about a conscious decision where you unite your mind and body in it for a particular goal, and that is to go without, to abstain from something for X period of time. And we'll talk about some of the different options here, but related to that is, when you go without, how you break your fast becomes so important. And I wanted to really launch in here because I've experimented with this enough where I remember how difficult it was to condition myself to even do a 16-hour fast. And that means, one of the benefits that I think is tremendous about that is that it locks in a ancillary element of fasting, which is your consumption window. And I use this example for people all the time because it harkens back to my high school days. And like I said, kind of different strokes here, but for the average person who is rushing to eat before their day begins, thinking that they need fuel, thinking that they need energy, I very much understand the impetus behind that. But let's say you're trying to eat, you're doing the right thing, you want to eat at home and maybe have a Whole Foods breakfast, or at least things that are free and in your home before you go into the office, before you take off for work. Maybe that's at, let's say, 6:30 or 7 a.m. And then you have your whole day, snacking, not snacking, lunch, no lunch, and then you look forward to your end of the meal day, and maybe you've gone to the gym and you're not eating until 7:30 or 8 o'clock. And then you're by the TV and you'd like a little dessert, or maybe it's just a bowl of fruit or something like that. But that is still 12 plus hours of consumption when your body is trying to process and use these nutrients for your energy. And especially with that later hour, this is when I think it becomes imperative that we give ourselves more time, especially before bed, when that is a natural rest and digest state. You don't want your body doing too much, when you're trying to sleep. You don't want to be digesting when you sleep. And I think if we're all paying attention, we get that feedback when we wake up in the morning, whether it's a growling or upset stomach, or we still feel full. Sometimes it's the surprising factor of you wake up and you're ravenous. And this just speaks to more conditioning. And we do need to relearn how to eat. And I want to tie this back in because I love to have, as best I can, one foot in the present and embrace the technologies that do improve our life, not make them easier. Because I do think ease, I think Denzel Washington said in a speech once that ease is a greater threat to progress than hardship. And of course, that's such an amazing statement because now we are inundated with ease and convenience. And it's hard to resist that. I get it. But we toughen ourselves and make our bodies more resilient. This was one of the hallmarks of my interview with Steve Kiley and Matt McClune, my strength coaches at BC High, is that through strength training and willfully giving yourself up to some challenges and having that resistance that you embrace, we develop a resilience which will pay incredible dividends, especially when we're talking about longevity and health span later in life. But uh, we the reason why I say we need to relearn how to eat is because with one foot in our ancestral world and one foot in the modern world, we come to understand that we cannot give in to every impulse. And of course, we know this on the dopamine front and the emotional front. My last episode was about anger. And those are impulses that do arise from within us, just like hunger. Hunger is not especially an external uh, feeling. But I often say to people, there are worse things than hunger. And I don't quite go down the road of, well, there's starving kids in Africa and how dare you throw out that food. It's not especially relevant to your existence. And yes, you can have an intuitive impression of that and entertain that perspective that you should be grateful for the life that was by pure serendipity that you were born into in this country, in this time, in this body, all those things so far out of your control. But then when you start to acknowledge the things that you can order, we do need to go back to this abstention from certain things that are otherwise so convenient. I remember Liver King talking about when he was on a hunting trip with his sons. He just pointed out the fact that he said, "Hey guys, I would really kill for a piece of gum right now, and I have one in my backpack, but I'm going to wait 15 minutes." And they, of course, said, "Yeah, why the heck would you do that? It's just a piece of gum. It's harmless. You can throw it in your mouth." But it is the disciplined idea of saying, "I acknowledge this feeling or impulse that I have, and I'm not going to give into it right away." And I had the best practice with this in these last couple of years being home throughout COVID because the pantry's there, the fridge is there, you're home. It's a different ball game than if you're at work and you've got to jump on Uber Eats or kill time. And go out to lunch and spend money and all those things that are, genuine limitations or roadblocks. If you do, things you should be considering when you are hungry, and okay, what does it take to satiate myself? Um, it was a great test to know that I had all this food, some good, some bad. It's definitely getting better, always available to me at my fingertips. Not even to speak of what you could order, and have delivered to you. That's another whole can of worms that shan't be open today. But it's like I said, you develop this conditioning and this retraining, and it comes with its pangs. But there are genuinely worse things than hunger, because we so easily associate them with starvation when we get the sort of complementary feelings of irritability, short fuse, whatever that manifestation is for people when they are not able to satiate themselves. But I'll pivot here to calling attention to how we think about breaking our fast. I think, bar none, protein and fat, if they're the first things you're putting into your body and your mouth for the day, that's a huge win right there, because those are, I remember Tim Grover talking about what a literal game changer it was for Michael Jordan when he transitioned from eating pasta and carbs and things like that, and potatoes and sweet potatoes before a game, thinking, as we all do, that we need that kind of energy to burn, to just eating red meat and steaks. And that has a much longer lasting burn off of your energy stores, as if you're investing in the type of energy you get from protein and fat. So, especially since breaking a fast is marked by an insulin spike, which is our body's knowledge of how we know that we've just had an injection of energy and that we need to respond to. It's okay if it makes you a little lethargic. It often does to me. That sometimes I plan my mid-afternoon naps around my first meal. I've already worked out. I've gone through emails. I've worked. My policy is in the morning I work on my business, in the afternoon I work in my business. So mornings, or when I get to sort through emails, do some game planning, anything like that, especially when I'm fresh. And you know people often talk about the mental clarity that they gain from fasting, especially if it's, you're just skipping breakfast and not eating until noontime or later. And simply put, that is just the absence of the toxins that are so pervasive in our modern diets. So when you just don't have any of those, you gain what is supposed to be our default state of mental clarity. And uh, absence makes the heart grow fonder. It also makes the stomach grow fonder. So I wanted to highlight that point of, it's good to be hungry. It's nice to miss something. It's nice to salivate. It drives some other motivating factors. I mean, especially if you can carve out the time to work out. Our bodies are built to handle stressful things in the morning. We've had our, 8+ hours of sleep. We've had that rest and digest period where we weren't expending any energy, so we should be restored. Sleep is another podcast and discussion, and I look forward. I'm hoping to have a bona fide sleep expert on, so to be determined on that. But these things are all, of course, related, because it is the sequence of how do we rest, fuel, expend energy, recover, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that cycle is our life. It's our life cycle. And I think it's great to have that experience of hunger and sit with it and know it. And you can divert it by throwing yourself into tasks and activities. For people who say, oh, I can't work out on an empty stomach, or I can't work out on the first thing in the morning, you're probably right, because you have not trained yourself to do it. There are so many parallels here between fasting and training, because it does warrant a fair level of training and conditioning. And it's, I can tell you from my first bouts with fasting, it is insufficient to say, well, I did it for, I tried a 16-8 one day, or I tried it for a week. That would be like saying I worked out for a week, or I did one super intense HIIT workout or CrossFit workout and it kicked my butt, and it's just not the ticket for me. You need a program. You need to give yourself, whether it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, a quarter, whatever it is, we need that testing feedback, and it can only we can only gain that feedback for ourselves over a period of time. Of course, if you're a very disciplined person, you want to try something for half a year, fill in the blank. I mean, that requires a lot of motivation and honest discipline. But I want to make some of these things a little bit more applicable. And so I just urge, if you're willing to dive in here, it should be more than a week, especially so you can have that comparison and contrast. But like I said, it's an absence that is so essential here. And when you do break that fast, you can still have carbs and fruit and things that exist on the other side of that. But first thing hitting your mouth, I really do advise it's protein and or fat. You'll see the benefit that you get from that, especially just with your energy the rest of the day. And I think it helps mitigate the desire to snack. And of course, we know how erosive uh, snacking can be. Like I said, from my own experience of being home during quarantine and all that, it's just so tempting. And the simplest mitigating factors are just don't have snacks out, especially if you have candy or easy to grab things that are on a table or in a bowl. Put those things somewhere hard to get. That is a simplistic but very, very valuable technique if you're trying to alter habits, is make it difficult. When I go through bouts of things that I want to do differently, let's say drinking alcohol, if I've had a couple nights during the week where I, found I was having a beer or two almost every night, you got to make it hard on yourself. And, especially if it's liquor, don't have that bottle of whiskey somewhere so easy to grab. Put it somewhere under something in the back of a cabinet. Make it difficult, because at some point you'll be going through all this trouble and say to yourself, gosh, is it really worth all this trouble? And with alcohol, I'm inclined to believe the answer more often than not is no, it's not worth all the trouble. And again, one of the many things that I look forward to speaking on with you all. And I can't wait to interview some of you to see what experiences you've all had with this stuff. But as we dive into the science a little bit here, one of my takeaways from following Dave Asprey that I thought was worth sharing is that we have more mitochondria than cells in the body. And we know it's a common euphemism to say that they're the powerhouse of the body. But how this pertains to fasting is that when the body and our mitochondria and cells are constantly feeding, meaning they're responding to the nutrients that we give it, they remain weak if they're in a constant feeding state. And even if you're not eating while you're sleeping, I mean, sure, that's 8+ hours when you, maybe it's 10 or 12 hours when you've gone without a meal, and 12 is better than 10, and so on and so forth. But in a fast, the process of elimination demands the most from the strongest and most energy expending mitochondria. And that is the right stimulus for the right fuel. And I won't get into too much of the ketosis discussion. I know that's another very in vogue diet and dietary approach right now. But the big takeaway here is we are perpetuating weakness in the body if we keep it in a constant state of it. Talk about feeding frenzy. Think about the RPMs of it. If your car was always running, if even when you weren't driving it, your car was still running, that would drastically shorten the life of, if not the entire car, I would imagine. And if there's any mechanics listening, please correct me if I'm wrong, or go through that thought experiment yourselves. But uh, I think that would be just too taxing for your car to maintain. And it's the same for your body. Autophagy is the word that comes up in the fasting world. And that is the repletion of your cells, and it gives them the ability for the weaker ones to die off, like we're talking about here, and the strong ones to take a more active presence in your body's use and processing of energy. So I wanted to highlight that, because as with anything, we want to, this is why I say that there's worse things than hunger, because hunger is just that response that your body is saying, okay, we've probably just about processed everything, but on the other side of that are so many incredible benefits. And when it comes to working out in a fasted state, to those people who say I can't do it, like I said, you're right, but you need that training. You need to test it, and you need to struggle through it to be able to realize what's on the other side of that. Is that, of course, number one, you didn't die. I'm still here. All the people who have done it are still here. But one of the things that does, especially if you've trained in a fasted state, is it raises your basal metabolic rate, your BMR. And if you can go another hour or two continuing your fast after you've exercised, what that does is it especially burns more fat as fuel. Your body, because it doesn't have any inputs, because you're not And there are, I think, to be perfectly fair, there are two schools of thought about this. I'm talking especially for those of us who are not professional or extreme athletes. And let's say you're training, to put a number on it, let's say you're training less than 8 hours a week, because I think really 6 to 8 hours a week total, or more, you are in that pretty established athlete range. And then of course north of that is professional range. But uh, we don't depend on immediate sustenance to help recover. If you're someone who's training 10 plus hours a week, it can be very beneficial for you, especially since you know that you're training later that day or definitely tomorrow. The other school of thought is that you do need pretty much whole food and real food in close. Paul Chek says before you stop sweating. So he has people bring protein snacks and cooked meats and things like that already to the gym with them, and so that as soon as their workout finishes, they're downing that stuff right away. So that's a brief diversion. But for the rest of us, and I'll certainly throw myself, I've been training less than 8 hours a week. I totally relish and value my rest days, and working in is something we're going to talk about another time as opposed to working out. But back to basal metabolic rate, you just let your body keep working hard. And we know this already from why we don't stretch or do intensive cooldowns. Yes, cold therapy is totally helpful and valid for your recovery as well. But the reason we don't stretch and do mobility work right after working out, or especially from a competition, a game, or a heavy practice, is because our metabolic rate is still rising often. I think the Russians determined 3 to 4 hours after an intensive bout of exercise. So especially for games and intensive practice, it anything you do right after the fact, if it's stretching or foam rolling or mobility work, a lot of that gets undone because you're still in a heightened state of metabolic response. But the tie in to fasting, of course, is that if you can delay your nutrient supplementation for, I would say, shoot for an hour. If you're fasted and you work out, if you can wait an hour, and sometimes that's great because you get to shower and cook, and of course we promote a whole foods meal after the fact, but you're letting your body continue to work harder. And it's just one of these added benefits of working out, is that it doesn't just stop with the workout. You can continue to gain, uh, especially when it comes to fat burning, well after the fact, and then you replenish. You replete, then replenish. So one thing I'll say for ketones that I have written down here is that they are anti-inflammatory by nature. So when you invest in a fat laden and protein heavy diet, of course ketosis is genuinely achieved after about 24 hours of a fast. So when you're doing a longer fast, you're in that state. But for the rest of us, if you pivot to more of a ketone oriented diet, those are doing you a tremendous favor by counteracting a lot of the inflammatory presence that some of which we can't help avoid. It's in the air, it's in our water, it's in our clothing, it's in our food, of course. So um, that this is one of the main reasons why I'm such a proponent of this type of dietary practice, because we do want things that are anti-inflammatory, and by embracing autophagy and letting ourselves do more work without depending on food. And again, this is just about getting away from a dependence on things that we've convinced ourselves and have then conditioned our bodies, because of the mind body connection, that I need food to think, I need food to work out. Keep telling yourself and it'll be true. But until you encounter a different stimulus, you'll really never know. So this is why I say it's so critical to relearn how to eat, because that is the only way that we then gain an influence over hunger and we can then control our hunger. So this begs the question, of course, what else can we go without? And what else can we retrain and bring more control over? And one of the things, I mean, I'm going to start with kind of a highbrow suggestion, but especially in this time, this is end of the first quarter of 2022, and you can fast from corporations. So for those of you who feel really strongly about any sort of pick it. I mean, whatever it is for you that you feel strongly about, if you know that there is a corporate or corporate like entity associated with the proliferation of that issue or injustice, then it is, of course, your responsibility to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And it's part of a reason why I'm just wearing a white cotton t-shirt right now. It's 100% cotton. It's a brand that I have researched, and I know they're made safe. And I know that, and of course, my body responds great to this, but I'm not going to be wearing too much of anything that I don't really support. And that's one of the ways that I walk the walk. Of course, I have my own slips of hypocrisy and things that I still want to keep doing, but I like this idea of fasting from corporations because they're the ones we need to starve. Like, so so while you're starving yourself, think about ways that you can fast from corporations. And if you just do a little research and things that presences of corporations and entities that we take for granted, just by not giving them your money, that can make a difference. Those are the ways that we precipitate change and bring about a response. But of course, there are other things that we can fast from, because we cannot eat a phone, an idea, a social movement, an emotion, an opinion, etc. So, of course, one of the classic examples is to fast from social media. If you feel that social media is doing you more harm than good, or if you look at that, I have to give a shout out to Instagram for some of the things that I don't agree with that they do, just to have an activity counter so you can look and say, holy cow, I spent 60 minutes on Instagram today. I lost an hour of my life, my valuable time. My eyes were here on this phone. So my pupils were not working how they should be. They're not looking at a horizon. I've harmed my ability to see and use my eyes to inform my world. Of course, I've done things to my neck and my head by keeping my eyes focused on this. I mean, there are so many tangents I could go off there, but just by acknowledging that, and this is why I say that knowledge isn't power, because you can have that knowledge that, sure, I was on Instagram for an hour today, so what? But applied knowledge is power, because once you apply that and say, well, I don't want to lose an hour of my day. My day, an hour is so valuable to me. Half of that could have been spent reading, writing, walking, working out, cooking, talking to my wife, talking to my husband, talking to my boyfriend, whatever it is. That's how we apply knowledge and then course correct and start to bring about some change. So, um, as we start to talk about some of these more specific time crunches of a fasting practice, um, think about a 12-hour fast from social media. Of course, a 24-hour would be great. A week would be even better. A month would be outstanding. Forever, of course, would be ideal, but then I wouldn't get to connect with many more of you and spread the word. So I understand the utility of these things, but as with anything, if you feel it getting on top of you and you want to be the master or mistress of your own fate and start to bring about a course correction, then a fast is a great way to start, because it just calls attention inward, and you get to then embrace something that I am all about, which is awareness. And that inner cognizance will just tell you, if you're listening and paying attention, well, how do I feel if I've gone a day without social media? How do I feel 16 hours without food? How do I feel if I fill in the blank? If I abstain from, of course, the news is a great one. I'm not a consumer of news. I'm a big fan of Substack, because I very much relish quality journalism, and I know a lot of those independent journalists who are seasoned veterans. They're going to Substack, and I enjoy a written piece that is well researched and is witty, and and someone's tone and style really shines through. But I remember in 2020, after the election concluded, and that was, of course, fraught with so much drama and division, I said I need a fast from news, and especially politics, because and there are great people like Crystal and Sagar at Breaking Points, and like I said, Substack has a lot of great political commentators, but I realized how that was getting on top of me. It was dominating so many of my conversations. It was occupying so many of my thoughts. And granted, we were all under the impression that this was a pretty significant moment in our country's course forward. I'll withhold my hindsight revisionist history of that at the moment, but still, when you're in it, it's tough to extricate yourself, admittedly. So, but just by paying attention, if you can take a step back, and this is, I think, going to be another imminent podcast episode, is just what's your review process? how do you determine what's working and what's not? And of course, that is the paramount question. Is what I'm doing working? Is what you say is truthful really manifesting as truth and love and happiness, or is it total dissonance? So think for yourself, what is the process by which I analyze what's working for me and what's not? And to bring it full circle, the benefit of a fast is that our bodies require, and we are getting the feedback every day from inflammation and anxiety and fatigue. It requires a break. And just to make a more deliberate point of this, back in the day when we did not have refrigeration, fast food, long-term storage food, it we were it was demanded of us that we do so much more with our minds and bodies without the stimulus of food. People would have to go so many hours and days until they could hunt or forage enough to feed each other. And we can mimic that. I mean, I'm not saying live monastically. I'm not saying punish yourself. This is I definitely want to get away from, for everyone's benefit, this whole punishment reward system that we've come to acknowledge for food. And you know, because it's such a slippery slope to say, well, I had a great workout today, so I'm going to go buck wild on some ice cream. And don't get me wrong, I mean, shout out the ice cream smuggler in Dennis, Massachusetts on Cape Cod, because I love my freaking ice cream, and I'll do anything to feel like I've earned it. But you got to earn it, and that doesn't make it a reward, and you don't then punish yourself with a fast or with eating broccoli or anything like that. I want to get away from that mechanism, because that's not what food is to us, and it really should never have been that. We can't source emotional things that are derived in a punishment reward response in our daily sustenance. We really cannot afford to do that. So, to wit, I think I want you all to know that I have full confidence that if you embrace any sort of fasting regimen, not only will you survive, I think you'll thrive. You gain that clarity, you gain that new strength that you weren't able to unlock before, and th- then that just propels you to do so much more. So I can tell you, I know that there are differences for men and women. I think I can look this up right. Actually, I'm going to honor my no lookup rule and just tell you to go look up the Bulletproof Radio Dave Asprey podcast. And most recently, again, this is end of March, he did a terrific episode with a woman, and unfortunately, her name is escaping me. But as I mentioned earlier, they dive into the differences between fasting, and they really focus on women. And a lot of it has to do with where you at in menopause, pre, post, in the thick of it. Of course, nothing I know anything about, so I'll shut my mouth there. But I do acknowledge that, especially around a menstrual cycle, even when I've been brazen enough to probe the own women in my life for some data on this, it's hard to maintain a longer fast, especially doing it perpetually. And one other caveat I'll mention is that this is not an everyday commitment. It's great if you feel like you can do that and you're already gaining some good feedback and you're not, suffering too much of the hunger pangs and feel like you can move forward with it. But what we're chasing here is metabolic flexibility. And really that's trying to build up our defenses against being fragile. And the examples are countless, but just knowing that if I have a pizza or a beer, or if I eat after 14 hours of fasting or 12, I'm not going to fall apart. And you only get there by developing your resilience and your training. And so that's why I'm on this kick, is to start doing it now. And for the record, I didn't dive in with 20 and 24 and 36 and 48-hour fast. It's been a 3-year evolution at least of doing throughout the week, pretty consistent, several days a week, 16-hour fast, which means 8-hour consumption window. That graduated to 18 and 20. And when I got to do that pretty comfortably, I would start doing 24-hour quarterly fasts. And that was a genuine stop eating at 6 o'clock one night and have dinner the next day, which is pretty great. I mean, because you go through a full day of acknowledging every every stomach growl, and when you're training and you don't feel like your energy's quite there, uh, it tests your mettle for sure. But man, talk about savory, salivating, biting into whatever that meal is, and hopefully you're smart about it. Picking your favorite things, especially favorite whole foods and whatever's really nutrient dense. Again, that's why I advocate for proteins and fats, because that's just incredible bang for your buck. But I'm this is why I'm so big on missing things and being the one to determine that I'm going to deprive myself of this, and the reward, such as it is, will be knowing that I earned it. And that's reward, capital R. Like I said, I want to get away from the punishment reward mechanism, but this is about telling yourself that I did what I said I was going to do, and that should never be taken lightly. We may not need external praise for it. I mean, for God's sakes, who's going to be able to keep up with us in our every whim and pivot? But that's why I think this is such a universal practice, is we get to train so many different facets of our spirit and soul and mind and body. And so I encourage any of you, if you're willing and able to dive in. For women, I'd say shoot for a 12 to 14 hour fast, and hopefully you're staggering that, thinking about when did I stop eating the night before. Hopefully that's several hours before bed, so that I do have sufficient time to go to bed and digest appropriately. It's great to go to bed hungry. That is such a, I think that is conducive to a deep sleep anyway. And then of course, when you get up to start your day, it's more of a genuine reset, and that's what we're after here, is a full reset. And I think you get much closer to that with a 16-hour plus fast. But break off as much as you can chew. For men and young men, I say do aim for the 16-hour fast to start. So that's a great 8-hour consumption window. And as much as you can shorten that consumption window from there, the benefits are myriad. And I'll have to speak on those with an expert another time. And I do know a few who will be able to shed a lot of light on that. But uh, it is, I'll say lastly, with a little bit of evidence that I did come across in reading a book not related to this, but I thought it was so incredible that we've established that among animals on this earth, not just humans, the most common longevity practice for animals on this earth is progressive caloric restriction. And one of the best ways that you can realize that is through fasting. Whether it's, so when you end up getting around 20 hours of fasting or more, then you're looking at one meal a day, two meals a day. You'll find, I genuinely believe that snacking is not as appealing to you. Snacking is not, that again, that is a symptom of modernity as well. And maybe you can be smart about it and have it be whole foods. We'll have to break that down another time for sure. But I think the essence of what we're getting at here is a couple things. Is that this is about health span and longevity. This is about starting to implement the practices that are going to give you a better quality of life when you're, in my example, 30, 40, 50, 60, and beyond. I'm not going to depend on just my, thankfully, I was able to have my grandparents around a long time. 3 out of 4 of them lived into their 90s. And knock on wood, I could only be so lucky. But I can't take that for granted. There are other factors at play, which, like I said, I've alluded to. Another podcast we'll have to do about that. But this is about health span. This is about training a resilience that I think we're going to depend on sooner or later. I don't know, because death and change are the only things that we can count on, really. And it is folly to invest a life in things staying exactly the same. And of course, the comforts of having food whenever you want and whenever hunger strikes, and 3 meals a day because that's the way things are done. I don't see that as a sustainable lifestyle. And so we're shaking things up here. When I ask myself that question, who's to say? It's because I want to know, am I just going off of someone else's word? Can I say this definitively because I've had the experience? Or am I just going off of convention and the momentum of things that have been done for decades and centuries? And I think if you start to ask yourself that question, who's really to say? How do you know? Is this really working? Then maybe you don't get to more answers. I love the Richard Feynman quote when he said, I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And of course, that has been a rather malevolent hallmark of some of the last couple of years is telling people that they can't question certain things. And that ain't going to fly here on this podcast. I'll be asking some more difficult questions. I'll continue to ask them of myself, but I'm sharing with you the fruits of some of the things that I have experienced because I decided it was time to seek a different course. And that's the life of the hunter adventurer is you go out of the comfort of your cave and camp, and maybe it's in the dark or maybe it's in the twilight, but you have to experience for yourself just what am I capable of, and you don't know by keep doing what you're doing. So to recap, fasting is going without. So if it's food, a certain type of food, a certain type of drink, a certain emotion, think about a way that you could start to change course here. And where might you test yourself and say, what would happen if I went without X for Y hours, for Z days, whatever it is? And of course, I'm sending you all the strength and vitality that is required to go that route. If you've been listening to this podcast, I know you're curious and capable. And I can't wait for my next chance to share more of this with you. As I mentioned, I have some great guests in the works, some really fascinating and competent and eclectic people, and their stories are going to be so entertaining and informational, and not least of all for me, because I'm the one who's easily entertained and easily amused, and that's been one of the greatest motivations for this podcast is that I want to start developing the skill to synthesize this, to share it with you all in a compelling way. And I mean, man, I'm having a ton of fun. This has been a total new renaissance for me to go back to a lot of the curiosities that I've had throughout my life. And I certainly don't feel old. I don't want to look old. And fasting and being conscious of our health decisions on a daily and hourly basis are the building blocks for that. So for today, I've been the one to say, I've been the one with the answers, but I want to thank you all for joining me again on another installment of Who's to Say. And once again, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll be talking with you again very soon.